Sego, it is Friday, August 3rd, 2018, and I am happy to be here. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people. We'll look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and a look forward to our ongoing battles for autonomy. Man, I lost all kinds of stuff. And our free and independent existence. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network. Streaming live from the Cattaraugus Territory of the Seneca Nation and simulcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Tandanaga. You can find us at www.letstalknative.com. I am John Kane. I'm the show's host and producer, and I'm joined in studio by Ed Schindler on mic with me here, and by Jake Proud on the board. Our studio engineer is Kelly McMillan, and I want to thank her for our setup. Look, I got two issues that I want to talk about tonight. One of them is what's coming up next Thursday, and that is next Thursday is International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. They do this every year at the United Nations. So August 9th from 3 to 6 p.m., that is where they have a special event, and they usually put a theme to it, and this year's theme is Indigenous Peoples Migration and Movement. Well, I'm registered to go there, and I'm going to have some things to say there. I'm going to talk about our issues with travel documents and free movement and that kind of stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. And I may say some things that perhaps have never been characterized quite the way I'm going to put them, not just tonight on the show, but how I plan to present it at the United Nations on Thursday. The other thing I want to talk about is I want to talk about mothers. And I know I've talked about women's issues before, and I've talked about how feminism may have left motherhood and mothers by the wayside in many of their strategies for empowering women. But we're at a time where the election season is starting to happen here in Seneca Nation in particular. And the questions that get asked, they said, well, what should be the topics that we discuss this year, and what should be the main threads that should become part of the political fodder, and the same things get talked about every time. The substance abuse problems, the elders care, these broad topics, and sometimes narrow topics. I mean, they'll talk about the need for dialysis, and things like that, health, better health and that kind of stuff. But what I want to talk about tonight is how, by addressing our kids as they're being raised, by addressing motherhood, and not just the mothers who give birth, but the women and men who raise children, especially those who do it outside of a couple, not just a marriage, but when a single parent is raising children, or grandparent, or whatever, what have you, aunts, sisters, whatever, and what we need to do to support those individuals, not just to support motherhood per se, but to address the issues with our youth and create a generational shift in the kids that are coming up behind us. So we're not trying to treat addiction. So we're not trying to educate those who have fallen through the school, the cracks of the school system. We're not trying to patch up people who have been damaged since childhood. That we address it early. So those are the two topics I want to talk about. So we'll get to that, the motherhood topic at the bottom of the hour. But I want to talk specifically, and Ed, you and I have talked some about this already. We've talked about the travel documents issues, especially as it relates to the Haudenosaunee passport and the issues relating to the failure of nations, especially the U.S. and Canada, to recognize our right to produce our own travel documents. So But I want to take it a step further, because if you saw how things play out, not just in 2010, but in with the Iroquois Nationals, but 2015 with the women lacrosse players, and then even this past last month with the Iroquois Nationals trying to use Haudenosaunee passports to go to Israel. What we face every time, and is resistance from the U.S. and Canada. The resistance to recognize our right to produce passports ourselves, and what they try to compel us to do is to embrace their system, to declare our citizenship to the U.S. or Canada and get passports or their travel documents, and not just to travel abroad. This is a challenge every single day for Native people, and this affects Mohawks in a big way because of Akwesasne straddling that imaginary line. But for those of us here in the western part of Seneca Territory, trying to go to Six Nations, and we meet these challenges with the border crossings with both the U.S. and the Canadian border services, and their failure to recognize our right to go to our families in other territories. And so if you really analyze what they're doing, what they're really trying to do is they're using travel restriction as a way to force us into their citizenship brigade, into their boxes. And I guess to raise this issue at the UN, I've got to remind them that the international community, not just since World War II, but even coming out of World War I, began this analysis of denationalization. And by the time the League of Nations would be formed, and ultimately the United Nations, the international community would accept that denationalization is a war crime. So the idea of compelling somebody to abandon or to displace a people's nationality with another nationality, to do that forcefully is a war crime. And look, when the United States passed the Indian Citizenship Act and declared all Native people to be U.S. citizens, that was in 1924. This conversation was already taking place coming out of 1913 in that time period. So when the United States does this, they are already doing this thing in a way that is against what is becoming the established international norms for rejecting and prohibiting this denationalization. And then as we go forward here, we see this increased pressure, especially since 9/11, with the United States forming its Department of Homeland Security and ultimately their Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. And yes, I call it Whitey because it is. They now have ratcheted up this whole idea that to travel, to even cross the U.S.-Canadian border, that imaginary line drawn through the middle of our territories, that we have to assert that we are either U.S. or Canadian citizens, which many of us still reject doing. But that is, that, again, you don't have to take, that's not like 4 steps away from a war crime. It is actually a war crime to try to force, to impose citizenship upon a people who are indigenous and who already have a distinct culture and civilization. And so that's what I'm going to present at the United Nations. I want to call Canada and the U.S., and for that matter, the rest of the international community, for allowing U.S. and Canada to dictate, and that's exactly what Israel did. Israel said, no, we won't issue you travel visas until Canada gives you permission, to leave and come back. So in spite of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, you have the U.S. and Canada being so starkly in direct opposition to many of the articles, not all of them, especially those that talk about self-determination. But then the rest of the international community, who may have accepted this UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples more willingly than the U.S. and Canada have, but they'll line up behind Canada and the United States on this stuff. So this is what I want to raise at the United Nations. And look, I carry a tough message, and I know that nobody has framed this travel document restriction issue in terms of an international war crime, but it really is. And we talked before the show. I know when you adopt a theme, and when you're talking about the world's indigenous peoples, and the theme is indigenous peoples, migration, and movement, it's going to be real easy to say, okay, this is about refugee issues. This is about whether the indigenous peoples have a right to migrate, across national borders and national boundaries, especially since those national boundaries came into existence after, much more recently, and they seem to violate what would have been somewhat traditional migratory patterns. So I think it's easy to think about migration and movement in terms of third world countries and refugees and people who are seeking asylum, but it's not. We face this issue every single day at the at this imaginary line, and we raise the issue on this passport issue every couple of years, and usually it's tied to lacrosse of all things, instead of really asserting. I mean, I get asked all the time, can you travel abroad? And I said, well, I hate to say it, but no, I can't. And again, if you try to travel as an indigenous person, you will meet all kinds of resistance. So what Canada and the United States says, you want to travel? You get our documents. You declare you accept the citizenship that we're imposing upon you, and then we'll let you travel. But if you're not going to do that, we're not going to let you travel. I mean, that's the issue that I want to raise to the United Nations. Any other thoughts? I mean,
the only other thought was when we were discussing why would they do this, and that's, I think, an important thing to consider is why would the U.S. and Canada require this to be done?
Well, I mean, and you and I talked about this, and part of it is there something they want to take from us? Well, they've taken so much. I mean, and they've taken practically, all that there is to take. Of course, we still have resources, but I don't think that's it. I don't think it's about land grab. I don't think it's about taxing us. I don't think it's about that specifically. I don't think it's about money. It's about putting a bookend at our existence. It's about saying, oh yes, America's so great, U.S. is so great, Canada's so great, that indigenous peoples have assimilated into the fabric of U.S. and Canadian society, and we haven't. And so they're trying to force that thing. And again, I can't state it as any more clearly than to say assimilation is genocide. And it meets the definition of genocide, because if you're trying to make a people cease to exist as a distinct people, which is exactly what assimilation attempts to do, then that's genocide. And of course, that genocide is perpetrated in the way our kids are educated, in so many of the restrictions that the states and the provinces and the federal governments of the U.S. and Canada try to impose upon us. And the travel restrictions are just an example of that. So I think this really is about making us cease to exist as distinct people. The United States, and Canada, after voting against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, did come around to say, oh yeah, we kind of support the aspirations, as long as they don't violate U.S. or Canadian law. So if they can, kind of squeeze us in such a way that we are full partners in their systems, if we are full participants, I should say, in the U.S. and the Canadian system, if we no longer maintain the levels of a distinction beyond just saying, okay, we're Americans or Canadians of native descent, if they can get us to that place, then that is the final solution. I mean, that is what their end game is, and there's no denying that. I mean, you've seen it written and spoken of by presidents from Washington and Jefferson all the way through. I mean, I've heard congressmen who say the biggest mistake that was ever made was allowing Native people to maintain the reservation system. Like that wasn't imposed upon most Native peoples, and what they call when our territories get erroneously referred to as reservations, they seem to ignore the fact that these are lands that we've maintained possession of. But and not to take anything away from our brothers and sisters farther to the west, where their lands now are held in trust by the federal government, and those frankly are fraudulent land deals. Those lands should not be held by the federal government. Those lands should be held in the same way that our lands are held, as fee title, original title, held by Native people, as a part of our indigenous claim to these lands. But I think this, look, the United States has managed to co-opt the National Congress of the American Indians, many of the other organizations. Canada has done the same thing with the AFN. When you think about Indigenous Affairs in Canada and the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the United States, it is based on their whole recognition process is based on us being a people subordinate to their laws under their jurisdiction. In fact, every aspect of FedRec is based on being under the United States, under U.S. law, under U.S. rule.
It's really important for people, for those who haven't been able to follow us. We were talking about not so much what, say, the United States wants from us, but more along the lines of what they don't want us to have. Okay? Throughout history, they've taken the language, the culture, the history. They've taken the people themselves. They've taken children, and they've taken women and sterilized them.
They've taken our lives and like you said, the right to reproduce.
All of that has been done, but it's not part of American history. And because
it's not part of told American history.
Not part of reported American history. But as long as we exist, that still exists.
That black eye, that stain on the United States. Like I said, when so many people were claiming this idea of taking children away from their parents at the borders, that it was un-American, that it stands against everything the United States represents, and I'm thinking, no, it's not. That's exactly what the United States represents. They did it to black children, they did it to Native children, and they did it to Japanese children. They've done it to people of color throughout the history of the United States. But again, it's not the spoken history. It's not the history that's in the textbooks. And so you're right. When you look at this, the whole reason for trying to impose U.S. or Canadian citizenship upon our people is to reduce the distinction, to strip our identity, so people can use words like American Indian or Canadian Indian. I mean, in Canada they want to say Canadian First Nations. I know a whole lot of Native people who reject having that title Canadian, strapped on the front of them. Just like I know a whole lot of Native people here, on this side of that imaginary line that reject it. Now, they've been pretty successful because I'll tell you, assimilation has been a powerful tool of the United States and Canada. They've, like you said, they've managed to strip away our languages to the point that most of our territories have language programs, but our original languages are not the dominant language. They aren't our first languages, and they aren't our spoken languages for the most part. They've disrupted our governing structures, either by corrupting traditional government, like what has been done to the Haudenosaunee, or imposing or having agents of theirs suggest written constitutions like the Seneca Nation has, or Indian Reorganization Act, IRA governments that again are always created as subordinate to the United States. And even language within the Seneca Nation Constitution doesn't just imply that, it says that directly. It talks about the United States, even in their own constitution. So this has all been part of that systematic, that strategy to create policies that would make us cease to exist as distinct people. I mean, that's why the United States and Canada voted against the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because they felt like it was going to prolong their process of trying to assimilate us and ultimately make us cease to exist as distinct people. In fact, they went so far as to say, if the United States uses words like self-determination, they don't mean the international definitions of those words. No, they want to be very, very clear. If the U.S. says self-determination, they mean internal self-determination. If they use words like sovereignty, they mean tribal sovereignty. So they put a precursor in front of these words so they can reduce not just the effect, but the meaning of those words. So when the United States says, well, we support self-determination as a general policy, they say clearly, and this is from their National Security Agency, that we mean internal self-determination. We don't mean that they can assert sovereignty, especially over their lands and resources. That's their language. They've said that in their own reports. What they say is, we mean that they can determine their membership, not citizenship. They can't determine who is and isn't their people. They just mean who is and isn't their members. Like we are simply a tribal organization. Those are the words they try to impart on us. So, I mean, I think this language and the strategy is something that is so embedded as a part of the U.S. Culture and Canadian culture that the idea and I mean the outrage that any of us would dare speak of things like decolonization is something that the United States won't even acknowledge it. They won't even acknowledge it.
No, and the real thing that baffles a lot is why are the people of Europe, people throughout the world, other than Canada and the U.S., why aren't they backing up the indigenous people who want to basically be able to move about in this creation? And then there's also be identified as who they are, not who they are supposed to be, supposedly.
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, it does raise the question, where's the international community on this stuff? I mean, again, Israel claimed that they were going to recognize the Haudenosaunee passports, and then didn't. They absolutely didn't. And I know there are people still out there saying, well, yeah, our athletes went to Israel on Haudenosaunee passports. No, they didn't. They went there on a waiver issued by Canada. Canada stated very clearly that they weren't recognizing Haudenosaunee passports, but they would grant a one-time waiver to travel without sufficient documentation, which is what they consider the Haudenosaunee passport. They call them fantasy documents. They don't respect our right to create these documents or to provide our own travel documents in any way, shape, or form. And the rest of the world concedes to that. I mean, again, Great Britain hosted the World Indigenous or the World Lacrosse Games, men's lacrosse in 2010, the Women's Lacrosse Championship in 2015, and that country wouldn't step up. The UK didn't step up. They maintained the same thing, that unless the United States recognizes Haudenosaunee passports, they would not issue travel visas. So they wouldn't take the stance and say, you know what, we're going to recognize them whether the United States does or not. And that's what we really need to call upon the international community for.
Right. And I think the other thing to call upon is that they have to start understanding why. Why is Canada and the U.S. doing this? Okay? Why are the other communities and nations within Europe saying that we have the right to have documents to travel, but then they don't back it up? What is the reason? And that's one of the things that we're trying to help people understand is, what does the U.S. and Canada want?
Well, they do this permanent forum on Indigenous issues every year at the United Nations. And they begin to at least formulate a debate over how to make the articles of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People mean something. How to enforce it? How do you hold nations accountable? And of course, how do you hold a country like the United States accountable for anything. I mean, that's what the international community is always wrestling with. I mean, all of the superpowers, China, Russia, countries, some of the nations of Europe, they can get away with all kinds of things because they basically have veto power at the UN in the Security Council. So nothing can happen without. I mean, the United States went so far as to resign themselves from the Human Rights Commission of the UN. Why? It was over Israel because they rejected the notion that the rest of the world wanted to condemn Israel for its crimes against the Palestinians. But the United States also does want to be held accountable for its own misdeeds and for what it does to not just to indigenous peoples related to immigration, but indigenous peoples as it relates to people who are still maintaining their distinction in their own territories. And the rest of the world, yeah, I mean that is a valid question. Why aren't they stepping up? I think we can make a few assumptions, but I think that is a question that needs to be asked and put to them directly. I think many of these these other nations, they need to come up with an answer rather than just saying, well, we have established protocols with the United States and Canada that we are bound to maintain. Well, that's not a good enough answer if those protocols allow those two countries to commit a war crime based on those. And I say that we have to ratchet this conversation to that level so people can really address this thing in the way that it needs to be addressed.
There's another interesting point that people should be aware of, and that's that a U.S. Supreme Court justice overruled a decision, and she used the Christian doctrine of discovery.
Well, she didn't override a decision. She made a decision.
She made a decision.
And she wrote the affirming opinion on a land claims issue.
Right, on the Christian doctrine of discovery, which happened to be through the Catholic Church, which stated that we were not human, and therefore we couldn't own land and things that we were arguing about.
It doesn't actually say we're not human. What it does is it says because we aren't Christian,
we're not human.
that we aren't human beings in the same at the same level as them. And so what they essentially assert is that we don't have the right to claim title to the lands that we live on. That only the Christian nations of Europe can do that. And when a Jewish liberal court justice cites something like this, that frankly, by the way, the UN Declaration has rejected any doctrines, any policies, any laws that create an injustice based on religion or ethnicity or national origin. It rejects that. So the doctrine of Christian discovery has been outright rejected in the third affirmation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and yet that's what Ruth Bader Ginsburg cited in the City of Sherrill versus Oneida. Hey, we're at the bottom of the hour, so we'll take a break. Okay. When we come back. We'll wrap up on this, and then I want to move into a discussion about what we really need to do in our communities to turn the tide on some of our social and societal issues on our territories and set an example for others. So we'll talk about that when we come back. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler. This is Let's Talk Native.
your children in the classroom. English history. What do they teach about the Indians? Took us prisoner in your fight to be free. Little white lies, little white lies, little white lies, little white lies. Keep on telling me your little white lies. Keep on telling me your little white lies. Say your lies don't hurt nobody. Only meant to know yourself. All the white lies only get bigger. Start to lie to yourself.
Or I guess we can do an instrumental here. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler, and this is Let's Talk Native. Hey, I want to give a shout out to our sponsors, Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, Legacy 420 in Tandanega, Mike General with Mikey G's and Mikey's Emporium. I want to thank good friends like Ed Schindler here, who makes a contribution to the show, on a fairly regular basis. Cynthia Trice, who also contributes. Roger Jock, Neville Spring, and many others who have helped the program in the past that have allowed us to continue to educate, entertain, and inform for the last 8 years. We are in our 9th year now, and we couldn't be doing it if we didn't have support from the community, from businesses, and from individuals. So I want to thank you all for doing your part and for joining the fight. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache Radio Net for providing our streaming. And again, I want to thank CKWE for their simulcasts and rebroadcasts of the show, as well as our internet partners, Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio. I want to thank them for carrying our show on their networks. And I want to thank all of the group pages that allow us to post our Facebook Live feed on those group pages. And I want to thank those of you who share the show. I want to thank Brenda, my wife, for sharing the show. She hits up a bunch of those group pages as soon as we go live. And I know many of you share the shows after that as well. You share our SoundCloud audio. You share it from our Twitter posting. You share our YouTube video. So I want to thank all of you for doing that. I think the conversations we try to have here are the ones that we're trying to encourage those conversations to continue well after the show airs. Hey, look, I also want to remind people that we are podcasts now. We are on the major podcast platforms. If you simply search "Let's Talk Native with John Kane" podcast, you will come up with a whole list of all these podcast platforms, and that includes iTunes and Stitcher, the TuneIn podcast, and Google Play. I also want to remind people that we have launched our new website, and we're fixing it up. We're still under construction a little bit, adding photos to our gallery. But that website is letstalknative.com. So it's www.letstalknative, all one word, no apostrophe. letstalknative.com, and there you can find the links to our podcast. You can find the links to our YouTube videos. It'll link you back to our group page for when we're live, and it'll link you to the media player that plays Let's Talk Native in a continuous loop. Old shows until we go live, and then it goes live. So all of that stuff is there, and of course we've got photos, from the history of doing this broadcast, and it gives a little bit of a history of how we came to be, and makes a reference to the show that I do in New York. Now I won't be doing my New York show this next week because I'll be at the United Nations, and they're finishing up the their fund drive at WBAI. So it's a good time for me to go to the UN and see what kind of noise I can make. And it's not to be disruptive. It's to ask the tough questions, which is kind of what I do. Hey, I wanted to shift gears. Did you have any final thoughts you wanted to mention on the UN stuff?
Not for right now.
Okay.
Let's move on to the.
Well, one of the things, because I saw a couple of postings on Facebook about folks from the Seneca Nation saying, look, we're as we go into the election, are there any topics that need to be brought forward? And like I said, a lot of the same topics get brought up, and we've talked about especially the drug problem, and we've had that conversation where we acknowledge that there's essentially 3 stages, where our people can be at with and roles they play in part of the substance abuse problems, and particularly with the opiate issue. We've got people who sell. There are dealers on our territories that we need to root out and put a stop to. But of course, that may not be just as easy as trying to end somebody's business, whether it's a legal business or not, but it's something that that has its challenges. We also have people who are addicted, who require treatment. So we do have a bit of a and I don't want to call it a law enforcement issue, but we have a prohibition that we have to put in place for people profiting from this. But then we have a treatment issue that we've got to deal with people who are addicted. But the third group of people, which to me are probably more important than the other 2, are the ones who are right there, as I say, on the precipice. The ones who are considering or maybe have started to use but aren't addicted yet. And that's a whole nother group of people that we need to pull back from that cliff, right? Well, as our conversations continue on this thing, I sometimes forget to mention that, look, if we have a whole bunch of people who are on that path to that cliff and they're going to run off that cliff, yeah, we can stop them at the cliff. But, maybe we need to stop them before they start making that journey, that headlong sprint to that cliff in the first place. So, I mean, Ed, you often talk about how dealing, alcoholism, suicide, even depression, these are symptoms of an underlying problem that we never quite get to. We're always treating the symptoms of the problem, not addressing the problem. And so while I don't think motherhood is the problem, I think supporting motherhood and supporting our babies and our toddlers, our infants, our toddlers, and our youngest kids is a way that we can make a generational difference, that we could stop it at that point. Now, look, we have a bunch of people who are already, as you say, practice makes permanence, who have developed habits because of the practice, because of what they've done with their lives. They are in that, and look, I don't want to call them just damaged goods, but they are in a lifestyle that may be hard to pull them back from. And I think we should do everything we can to help those people. But the solution isn't addressing the symptom. It's addressing the problem. And if we did more, so if somebody wants to ask me, what is the one thing that we could do that could have the most significant difference to our people, I say it's support mothers. I say it's support infants and toddlers and our youngest children. So, and I'm not the first person to suggest this, but I think the whole idea of developing programs that never leave a child wanting for their necessities or for a level playing field, not just with the outside, but I'm saying let children not have to experience that the inequality right on our territories, the haves and the have-nots. Let's not cast a bunch of kids because of who their family is or how much money they have as a child that's going to forever be behind the 8 ball. And I'll tell you, it isn't just the folks who don't have that struggle. The affluent people in our community struggle just as much, and part of it is because we have created this whole dynamic of judging what is success and failure based on the accumulation of wealth, and that's something we have to get away from. Now, we're not going to change people who are already fixed in those patterns. I think we have to help them, but if we focused, especially on single parents, not just mothers, but fathers too, single parents who have the challenge of trying to raise children and support a family or a household or whatever that is. If we provided skills trainings for not just for parenting, but for for lifestyle choices and for career planning, all of that stuff. If we wanted to pick out a singular population, or group within our population to apply resources and attention to, it would be those who are bearing our children and those who are caring for our children, and give them as many resources as possible, and bring them back to, as we were discussing off air, Ed, create a brand new sense of community with these children. So we're no longer trying to create outcasts within our own communities. And because the idea of allowing this exclusion of certain people and the inclusion of certain people, that's how we create not only a class system, but a system that fails. It fails those who claim to be the wealthy and the upper class, because look, we see it time and time again. Wealthy people are struggling with mental illness, suicide, with depression, with substance abuse. So some of the most affluent people in our communities have some of the most tragic stories associated with their lives and their families and their children. So if we started providing the necessary resources to I have a fresh start, clean the slate, so mothers in particular, but again, single parents, even if they're men, mothers in particular, have a better sense for the role they need to play as mothers, the standard that the community expects out of them, and the rewards that come with it. Because this is the problem. I wrote a piece on Facebook this week after hearing some tragic news, and I talked about this idea that the pursuit of happiness has become a life-threatening journey. One that takes us away. We're trying so hard to be happy that we've lost the ability to be happy. And we find it in those euphoric moments that alcohol or drugs give us. We find it in those euphoric moments that when we're partying, or only when we're celebrating something. We don't find it in the small moments. We seem to be incapable of understanding that, yes, we can have challenges in our lives. We can mourn the loss of loved ones. We can stand up and fight systems of oppression, racism, and all that stuff. But it doesn't mean we have to be unhappy. We don't have to be miserable doing it. I got asked the question, and I brought it up a couple of times. I got asked the question, John, aren't you ever happy? And I'm thinking, why would somebody ask me that question? Simply because I have tough conversations? Why would that warrant a question? Anybody questioning my happiness? I'm a really happy guy. I've got a great family. I've got good kids. I've got great grandchildren that I enjoy. Perhaps maybe that's it. I enjoy my grandchildren at a level that most people, or too many people, don't have that. And it's because it's not that it's not available to them. They have gotten themselves caught up into other cycles of lifestyle that destroy happiness. So when we want to support mothers and we want to support children, we have to create a better environment for those young mothers and older mothers, I mean, and grandmothers for that matter, if they're raising children, for them to be able to recognize the goodness and those euphoric moments that you can have. Maybe it's just sitting by the side of a pond fishing with your children, or maybe it's maybe it is a celebration like a birthday party, and not one that has to have coolers filled with Bud Light. I mean, I look at how people celebrate their children, and even that's disturbing. I mean, Chuck E. Cheese, Chuck E. Cheese serves alcohol. How is that even a thing? I mean, this is a company who advertises on PBS that Chuck E. Cheese is where a kid can be a kid. Yeah, a kid can be a kid while their parents are getting sloshed drinking draft beer, for crying out loud. So, look, we can't wait for our children to become damaged youth and damaged young adults or damaged adults. If we wait for that, now we're trying to fix a problem and never address we're trying to fix a symptom of a problem, and we're never getting there.
Yeah. One of the things that people who've gotten to know me, when I see them, I greet them with good morning. And it doesn't matter what time it is, what part of the day. And they know, some of them notice that and say, it's not morning, it's 7:30 in the evening. I said, I learned from a medicine man in South Dakota, and he used that in the sweat lodge. He said that it was understood that this moment right now is the dawn of our future. And from that, I got the concept that every moment is a good morning.
Well, every day is a beginning, right? Or every moment is a beginning.
Every moment is a beginning. And with that, he explained that was one of the ways which they helped the men coming back from Vietnam, was because with them understanding that what happened has happened is not something they need to carry with them anymore. They can set it down, okay, and learn to become human again. Because when they went through the military, basically you get dehumanized so that you don't hesitate shooting at someone, okay? And that's what they had to go through. They became dehumanized, and then the enemy was dehumanized. And then they come back, and they're feeling that they've gone through PTSD, okay? And they had to be helped by the community to come back to being a community member, being a person, okay? And that's what I think we have to start understanding we have to do, is to accept each other as a person. And if there's a need, then help to find that need to fulfill it, to whatever it may be. And there's an understanding that you can't help someone if they don't feel they need to help, okay? And one of the best ways which people find they need to help is their children, because it's when they find their children crying when they come home that they find that something's not right.
Well, and this gets to, a topic that you and I have discussed many times over, this notion that we can't tell people what to do.
Right.
And I kind of reject that. And I'm not saying that we need to impose, our individual will upon somebody else. But I think there are standards that we need to raise in a community. Look, I get it. Relationships don't always last, like they did in the past, right? Or like, I've been married for 36 years, and I'm the exception to the rule. I see one of our friends on Facebook saying my baby's ma failed me. Well, it wasn't her job to. I mean, it wasn't that she failed you. There's a relationship that crumbles, and part of it is we haven't. We don't look at our families as being permanent, and so we, that's why you can see, some young women who have children by 3 or 4 different men. You have men who have children by 3 or 4 different women. And look, I'm not saying that's not what I'm trying to address with this proposal. I'm saying I accept that that's the case. And that we've had relationships that have failed, but how do we stop that from affecting the next generation? Mm-hmm. So if we can create programs that support women and men who are raising children by themselves. So, even as those single parents are trying to earn a living, that the daycare, for instance, is solid and that it involves them, or it involves other members of the community. Not just it's not just an institution that you dump off your kid and pick them up after your workday without any awareness on what transpired with your kid for that 8 hours. I'm saying we've got to change something, fundamentally change the systems that we have brought into our lives. And again, part of it has been born out of the necessity because of failed relationships. But we have to do something different than what we're doing. And it's not enough to say it's her fault, it's his fault. Look, there are also women who've lost their husbands. My daughter's an example. For whatever reason, that a child becomes raised by a single parent or orphaned altogether. We have got to place our children as a priority, and we have to do that through really, really important skills training, and among those skills training has to be parenting. And look, I'm not saying we've got to come up with somebody else's textbook for this. This program doesn't exist anywhere. This is something that has to be somewhat culture based. But again, I can't say this strongly enough. This is the way that we don't fix the mother. We provide the mother with the necessary tools so we can prevent the children from beginning that path towards that cliff, towards that precipice. I mean, because too many of our kids head that way. Even if we say, well, that's just a phase. Yeah, they're going to go through that. You'll have that. And I'm thinking, why? Why do we have to have that? Why do we have to accept that our kids are going to have that phase of their life where they have to spend a couple of years getting drunk, getting stoned, and risking so much of their lives, and during that period of time is where some of that child rearing starts, right? So look, I'm not trying to put mothers on a pedestal, because I'm not saying, look, in spite of the flaws of this person here, I want to put her cast her as a revered individual. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying let's help her do the job that is required of her as a mother. Let's give her the resources, and some of those resources need to be financial, folks, and not necessarily give it to her to exploit. I'm saying let our kids have great lives. Let our children have the best childhood they can possibly have. So when they enter school, they're not going into a school playing catch up. Whether it's our school or their school, whatever it is, that our kids have the confidence, that they have the self-esteem that right now our children are lacking. I see it. I see it in so many of these households where you see a young girl trying to raise kids because because she had her first set of children before she was even 18 years old. But even women that are older than that, I just see that motherhood is something that we just say they just have to get it by themselves. And even as we try to help as family members, we aren't doing it as a community. So by creating and I don't mean just an institution, but by creating the support systems in place, whether it's family or clan or community, however we do it. But part of that is going to make sure that no child is left hungry, no child is left feeling like they are second class to other children. I mean, let our kids enjoy their childhood. Let them be the most confident people they can be, even as they begin their education. And of course, if we're doing this thing, it will be very easy to put language into that and culture into that. Because as we're trying to shore up that generation and draw a line in the sand and say, no, we're going to do that with the mothers right now who have small children. And it'll be more definitive with the babies than even with the with the toddlers and elementary, the under 10 crowd. But if we began that process now, look, we're not going to see the immediate effects. We're going to see those effects in 5 or 10 years. And it'll impact an entire generation, and it could be such a significant change. So while we're talking about funding dialysis machines or building more elder centers or putting treatment facilities together for our addicted substance abusers and those people who are afflicted with addiction, if we don't begin to have a meaningful conversation about what we're going to do for those mothers and for those, more importantly, for those children at the earliest ages possible, so they don't head towards that precipice in the first place. I'm all for pulling those kids back, but it's going to be a lot easier if they don't have a head full of steam heading for that cliff in the first place. So that's one of the things that if you're going to ask me, what do we need to prioritize? That's what I'm suggesting. That's what I'm suggesting.
Mm-hmm. There's we did a program earlier about some of the things that we should be learning, not just the children, but everybody. And that's skills that once were part of the culture, and that was listening,
communication in general.
Yeah, and empathy, understanding what someone's going through so that you can, be able to relate to what it is in a manner, whichever way you can do that. Patience, camaraderie, where someone doesn't feel that they're less than someone else. They have a camaraderie. Their grades may not be as good in Gowanda as they could be with everyone else, because learning, actually doing things is one way to learn. And it's not to sit there and listen to the teacher and memorize whatever.
We definitely need to have a different approach in philosophy towards what we're doing with our children. And I know we've talked about building schools, and I think that's a part of it. But this is even before our kids get to a school.
Yes.
Regardless of whose school it is. So that's my suggestion. So anyway, look, we're pretty much out of time. We'll be back here on Monday, and we'll tackle another issue then. And of course, look, there's still time if you're interested in going to New York and being a part of this this international day of the world's indigenous people. Then I think the registration ends tomorrow or Sunday, so there's still time to do it. So you can look it up online. I've got a link posted on my Facebook group page, so check it out there. Again, I want to thank you for listening, and we'll be back here on Monday. I want to thank Yahweh.
Something going you up, Yahweh.